Greetings and welcome to Ethio-Digest, and thank you for joining us. In today's program, we will present the first part of our two-part commentary regarding the failure of the Ethiopian opposition on the diplomatic front. This first part discusses the lack of response from the international community. The second part of the presentation, the episode following this one, will exclusively deal with the formidable challenges facing Ethiopians in the realm of diplomacy. Thank you for joining us. Condoning the Ethiopian genocide, the role of the international community. Once again, the international community has failed to stop a catastrophic regional war. Once again, the lives of millions of Africans are on the verge of being consumed by the warmongering governments of the United Arab Emirates and its proper colony, Ethiopia. Ladies and gentlemen, our usage of the word colony is not a mere passing remark. It is rather our premise for labeling the struggle of all Ethiopians as a war of liberation. We will elaborate on this a little later. But first, we want to focus on what we believe is an utter failure on the part of the international community to stop a genocide. We are delighted you are able to stay with us through to the end. Thank you. What surprised most political observers in how an American government with the Republican-led Senate, a Republican majority in the House, and a Republican president in the White House, ended up supporting a government that denies the constitutional rights of a nation's citizens to bear arms. Any similar move in the U.S. would simply be unthinkable, because the Second Amendment guarantees that age-old American tradition of a citizen's right to bear arms. In Ethiopia, the right to bear arms is not only a constitutional right, but it is also an age-old tradition that became a necessity to survive. Let's put it this way. In some regions, even in the relatively peaceful periods of the nation's history, the very survival and continuation of any family or individual is completely and totally dependent on the individual's or the family's ability to arm themselves. Even in the times of relative peace in the nation's long history, no one dared to take away those rights, until a juvenile delinquent appeared on the scene and launched a genocidal campaign against the Amharas and decided to disarm them. Ladies and gentlemen, this is taking place in a part of a continent where every type of armed group that included Al-Shabaab and Janjaweed militias continued to roam. It is in the backdrop of this jihadist movement that Abiy Ahmed decided to selectively disarm the Amharas. The decision to disarm these tens of millions of Amharas, who are predominantly Orthodox Christians, is taking place in this region where the Abiy Ahmed, Shimelis Abdisa, Ararsa Merdasa and Kori Naginya crime network operates openly and carries out extrajudicial killings of Orthodox Christians and Amharas. And simply put, this is probably the worst of betrayals Amharas and Orthodox Christians have ever endured. While this may or may not directly affect an American interest in the region, we raise it here as a question of principle, because the Republican Party's uncompromising stance on the citizens' right to bear arms is alive and well. But even more interesting and ironic is the clarity of the American evangelical movement on this subject. Evangelicals quote chapters and verses resembling to Luke 22:36, where Jesus advised his disciples to arm and defend themselves. Now, It is this self-proclaimed head of the Ethiopian Evangelical Council of Churches, also known as Abiy Ahmed Ali, who ordered this disarmament and ethnic cleansing campaign against Amharas and Christians. Again, we must remind the world that this is happening in the region where jihadist paramilitary units are enjoying the anarchy across the Sahel, stretching from East to West Africa. When we turn our attention to the international community, that at best is staying silent, we are baffled by the visa restriction moves made by the United States government, again a Republican-led American government, to avert the conflict in the Horn region, which reminds us of the time when travel and visa restrictions were imposed on Prosperity Party and Ethiopian government officials for their involvement and leadership in the Tigray genocide. This was how the president of the Oromia regional state responded to the U.S. government sanctions.
ሞያሌና አድዋ ለመሄድ ቪዛ አስፈልገኝም። ከዛ ውጪ እኔ ብዙ እንቅስቃሴ ስለማደርግ አያውቁኝም፣ አላቃቸውም። ስለዚህ የውሳኔው እኔን አይመለከተኝም እንድታደርሱልኝ። ከዛ በዘለለ ነቀዝ የበላው ስንዴ ነው የሚቀርብን፣ ቢቀርብን ይሻላል ተባብረን።
By far, no one else we know of has insulted life-saving programs paid by the American taxpayers' money in such vulgar terms and manner. But it did not matter to the State Department that turned around and made up with Abiy Ahmed. And if that was not enough, the U.S. government lifted the military sanctions imposed on Ethiopia to appease this genocidal maniac. How many Americans know about this child play? Though we lack an accurate count of what the polls might suggest, we do not think that legislators in Capitol Hill and the American public in general had any knowledge of this, because if they did, the least anyone can expect would not be silence. Thus our argument. Not enough is done on the diplomatic front to create global awareness on the plight of Ethiopians. Not enough is done to expose the misogynistic junta's crimes against humanity. But this question leads the diaspora to the point of taking a responsibility in getting the word out. We must assert that this diplomatic debacle is not a mere rerun of the Three Stooges, a slapstick comedy where physical violence is the one theme that's ever present. This is rather a real-life farcical tragedy that's consuming lives on a daily basis. Why do we say that? Because after the failures of the international community to act and achieve the peace, what we ended up with is another round of visa sanctions on a few individuals. A futile exercise par excellence. We have only one request. Get serious. All that muscle and all that derriere and you can't shake it? The U.S. has all what it takes to stop the war, if it wants to. But the current sanctions imposed on the few individuals to bring the peace in the region have as much chance of being successful in filling the Sahara Desert with gardens of flowers and roses. Even though the war in the Amhara region, for the reasons we mentioned above, is killing hundreds of people every day, there are those who could not wait to see a full-fledged regional conflict take place. And there are world-renowned war prophetess who are counting down the hours to make their money on another African war. We have good news for them. They do not have to wait for too long. We can speak with certainty, though, that the looming war in Ethiopia and the region is completely avoidable. But that is only possible if the United States decides to prevent this major regional conflict. We state that comfortably only because we are convinced that Abiy Ahmed would not dare to refuse any instructions from the U.S. government. The United States government can stop all the atrocities and the wars by telling Abiy Ahmed Ali to abdicate his office and save the nation. Why do we recommend that? Because, one way or the other, the future of Ethiopia will not be dictated by a single moron who genuflects and takes orders from the new colonialists, also known as the Al Nahyan family of the United Arab Emirates. It therefore becomes imperative to book the last flight for Abiy Ahmed and company to Abu Dhabi and save lives, communities, and nations. We know that is easier said than done, because the US government is not interested in offending America's two great partners, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, and force them or pressure them to stop their proxy wars in the region. The American government also do not feel the urgency to distance someone who is willing to do anything for the US. At the outset, Abiy Ahmed is not only allowed to do what he wants with the nation, but is also getting a lot of help from major players in the international community. The US lifted the military sanctions imposed on Ethiopia. The European Union is lending out a hand with 100 million euros or so to assist Abiy Ahmed's war efforts, spearheaded by Emmanuel Macron and Giorgia Meloni's direct military training and advising contracts and agreements. Even after witnessing that more than 80% of the Ethiopian armed forces are engaged in a full-scale multi-front war in the Amhara region. Even after confirming that the 7-year-old war in the Oromia region continues with no end in sight. Even after observing the 2-year war in Tigray that consumed 1 million people, is being followed by a deliberate and systematic collective punishment of the entire population. Even after realizing that the Ethiopian army has not won a single war in any major conflict for the last 8 years. Even after confirming that there would be more death and destruction in Ethiopia. And even after watching all of this unfold in real time. The international community chooses to ignore the suffering of communities across the region. But why? Here are the reasons. First, the current wars that take place in the world, the Russia-Ukraine war and the US-Iran war, are more consequential to the world order and world economy than the fighting between Africans. Whether it takes place in the Amhara region or Darfur or Tigray, Oromia, Somali or Afar regions. Second, there are world powers that are benefiting from the wars and would want the war to continue. The 4-year-old war in Sudan, with the Rapid Support Forces fighting to secure the interests of the Emiratis, is officially joined by Abiy Ahmed Ali's government. And neither Abu Dhabi nor Addis Ababa and the Janjaweed militias want to stop this war. The continuation of this war is the only guarantee that the gold from Western Sudan can find its way to Dubai. Third, what goes around comes around. This timeless adage rings true to everyone who is holding on to power. No leader in their right mind would want to see a fellow president or prime minister get toppled by a popular movement. Their reason is obvious. What goes around comes around. What began as a singular act of defiance and resistance by one young North African did not take long to turn and become the Arab Spring and spread throughout continents and topple governments left and right. We also witnessed the anti-colonial movements of Africa and Asia and the Orange Revolution in Eastern Europe. The domino effect of the people's movement for justice and democracy is nothing new to the world. Thus, the fear of the contagious nature of popular unrest. Therefore, the African Union is not and can never be a union representing the interests of the continent. Its primary task is to preserve the status quo. However brutal, however evil, however criminal, however tyrannical, and however misogynistic one is, the Brothers in Arms, also known as the African Union, will be there to support their counterpart. They do not want an African Spring, an Arab Spring, or any kind of spring. Yes, they are willing to extend winter indefinitely. Knowing that no help will ever arrive on time and keeping in mind that Ethiopians cannot rely on external forces to solve their problems, we should still answer why we registered failure in the diplomatic front. While we run out of ideas as to what magical number of casualties or which lucky calendar year the world is waiting for, we are not surprised by the ugly truth that every other leader in the world knows whom they are dealing with when they deal with Abiy Ahmed. Even his most frequent visitors and donors to his most expensive palace projects, Meloni and Macron, and even his fellow despots across the continent, who could not keep the peace or stop the bloodshed in Johannesburg and Nairobi, and others who joined the choir and praised Abiy Ahmed, know very well that every time they meet with Abiy Ahmed, they are aware of the fact that they are shaking hands with the devil. But what is even more worrying is that they still keep doing it. If turning a blind eye to the untold sufferings of Ethiopians was not enough, it was surprising to see the champions of democracy in the West embrace Abiy Ahmed with open arms. All the reasons we mentioned up to this point regarding the failure in the diplomatic front have little or nothing to do with what Ethiopians were able or were not able to achieve. And we believe that the focus of Ethiopians should be on what they can actually control and what they can actually achieve, and not on how unfortunate they are, and not on how disappointed they are by people whom they have no control over. The resolve to bring the gruesome reality to the forefront on the world stage is all that is needed, but it needs to be followed by a thorough, well-thought-out action plan. This act of bringing forth the voice of the voiceless and the less fortunate may or may not bring the required results every time. But it would surely put on notice the powers that swear by the so-called democratic and Western values. We must remind ourselves that it took 5 long years for Europeans to respond to Haile Selassie's pleading for justice. And even then, it was not because they honored the cause, but it was because Mussolini became Hitler's ally and Hitler was roaming all over Europe. We must also remember that it took close to 1 million Rwandan lives for the world to act and stop the genocide. And in spite of the 4-year-old war that is devastating Sudan, the Sudanese still remain in the hands of the Janjaweed militias, who conduct massacres without slowing down. In condoning Abiy Ahmed's tyrannical rule, the most common testimony we heard is the description of what is happening in Addis Ababa as a miracle. Before we go any further, let us just remind the meaning of the word miracle to some who used and abused the word. which includes our African friends. The meaning of a miracle is described as the suspension of reality. Now, which part of the so-called corridor development in Addis Ababa is a miracle? Is it the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people from Addis Ababa? No, that cannot be considered a miracle. Is it the building of some high-rising buildings or putting some street lighting around Bole and Arat Kilo? That still does not amount to a miracle. It might look and sound like a miracle for people who live their entire lives away from civilization. But our commentators, who witnessed the so-called miracle, are not unaware of the progress humankind has made in building cities and parks. But unfortunately, they also know that, without flattering Abiy Ahmed's project that turned Addis Ababa into a brothel, they would run the risk of getting a cold shoulder from Arat Kilo. But why should that matter? It matters greatly because of the nature of the man we are dealing with. Abiy Ahmed Ali is a spy. These are his own words, not ours. And ladies and gentlemen, once a spy is always a spy. The man would not hesitate to bring out the dirty laundry of the fornicating statesmen and African diplomats. He would not think twice about leaking evidence and proof of wrongdoing by pedophiles of Arabia, Europe, and Asia. The publication of these files would make the things included in Epstein files look like a common felony. It is therefore logical to conclude that no outstanding contribution to this struggle for liberation and justice should be expected from the international community. But we must conclude the first part of our commentary with a rather daring, cunning, and yet cynical view and analysis of the role of the international powers regarding the current volatile situation in Ethiopia. The analysis alleges that the silence we observe in the international community is not a reflection of a mere ignorance on their part. It's rather a well-thought-out cunning plan that would outsmart the fox any time of any day. It is based on a premise that the world knows that Abiy Ahmed's days are numbered. The world also knows that wrestling with a pig would not only result in losing a fight, but it would also turn the contender to an untouchable filthy creature. Europeans, who are well versed and seasoned in diplomacy, are not intrigued by Abiy Ahmed anymore. But instead of confronting him, they chose to pamper this monster. They figured that the end result would remain the same. The tyrant would be ousted. How? It is like the story of the frog in a pot full of cold water, who enjoys the slowly rising temperature of the water until it makes a seamless and enjoyable transition from being alive to becoming someone's dinner. Dead, of course. This, they believe, is the most humane approach to ousting a tyrant. Though we don't feel obligated to make a remark on this alleged stance of the international community, we will always hold a strong contempt to the powers that are cooperating with Abiy Ahmed in his ethnic cleansing venture. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our presentation for the day. Please join us for the second part of our presentation that will address the failure in the diplomatic front as it relates to the Ethiopian opposition movements and the diaspora community. Please feel free to share your thoughts and comments on our presentation. We also want to remind you to please share and like our programs. Thank you for joining us, and we wish you the best of times.